rise. Please be seated.
All right, Mr. Witness, where is he?
He's right here, Your Honor. It is now the time that we should argue about the state's timeline video.
I don't think so. The next time the jury would see it would be during deliberations if it's admitted, right?
Yes, sir.
Right.
I didn't know if there's something I needed to add. I have it admitted as substantive evidence.
I don't know. I mean, you've offered it, and I've said it's for ID purposes only at this point. And we're in the midst of dealing with the witness, so we can talk about it another time, I imagine. Bring the jury. Where's Mr.
He's here.
Oh. Hiding behind the screen there. You have to resume your seat, I believe.
Actually, I've got some questions to ask.
Oh, right. You're still down there. Okay.
Step over there. That's good. Sorry.
All jurors present, Your Honor.
Okay. You may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. I just have a few more questions. Your Honor, this time, I'll ask to publish States 13, which was introduced through Brian Childs. And if we could have the sound turned on. Mr. Williams, I'm going to ask you to, I don't believe you've seen Mr. Childs' presentation that was
Not
given
at all.
at having. You have sound in? Now, Mr. Williams, regarding regarding the syncing that you did at the start of the red cone 1 for the first taser activation.
Yes.
You did not use that area as an anchor point, correct?
No.
Okay. I'll ask you to go to that area on your timeline, which is State's Exhibit 245 for identification right now. And let me ask you this before you even start playing. You have this playing, turn around. You have this playing through QuickTime.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And to advance QuickTime with your timeline, does the arrow key work like?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can pull the slider to jump to a specific time, scrub it.
Okay. If you could go to just when the animation has the two men turning the corner onto the yellow brick road.
Right there.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
And if you could play that section through where you have to mark the Taser 1 activation.
Okay. Tell me when you're ready.
Okay? Okay. So, you said you didn't anchor those two noises at the beginning,
No.
but they somehow line up. How did that happen? That the pop of the firing of the taser, how did that sync up with your red cone area if you didn't?
I think it's a verification that we have a pretty darn close alignment of everything.
Okay. You used other audio to anchor, not that taser sound and taser time.
Only the two voice ones that we discussed earlier were my
I'm
anchor.
sorry.
Only the two voice portions we discussed earlier were my anchor points.
Okay. And then if we could go, if you could slide forward to just past taser 5. So a little bit forward that. Okay.
Right there?
A little bit further before we get to the Santana video.
Okay.
Go back up. Video.
So you wanted to
Go
start
to
it?
where the 3 seconds is right there.
Okay.
So.
Right there? Okay.
All right, so this is at 9:37:32, and shortly after this, the Santana video comes into,
Yeah, within seconds. I mean,
Okay.
these 3 seconds and a couple more.
and you have taser 6 lit up. Not now, but when that gets there.
Yes.
Okay, if you could play that section through the intro of Santana's video.
Everybody ready?
That should be false, correct?
Remount Road next to the Money Man and the fire station.
Back that up one more time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have taser 6 being activated before we see Santana's video.
I do.
Okay, and why was that?
The ticking on the Santana video I'm taking as the end of taser 6.
Okay. Based on, if you had taken that as being the first part of the tasing, it would have,
You would have seen what we just heard earlier, be offset by that time.
and run up into the shooting.
It wouldn't be that far, but yeah, it would
Run
push
out
everything
further.
forward.
Okay, push everything forward, okay. Play that again.
That should be across, correct?
Remount Road next to the Money Man and the fire station.
Let the person go. This way, if you can have a seat back up there and
Can we
answer
close
any,
this down?
Mr. McHugh, do you need that?
I will, but not right now.
Okay.
If we could move it out of the way so that the judge can, so that everyone can observe everything, because I would like to be able to
Move what?
just move the podium around to make sure that I can get to his, I'm not going to interfere with his audio visual.
All right, Mr. McHugh.
Good afternoon, Mr. Willis.
Good afternoon.
We talked a bit yesterday, and you had a chance to explain to the jury today a little bit about your background and the work you did in this case. I believe you said that really what the solicitor wanted to get from you, bottom line, was a distance when shots were fired between Officer Slager and Mr. Scott. Is that correct?
Well, that was one of the things I was asked to do, yes.
And you said that you've had experience in scene recreation. You haven't had any training in crime forensic analysis, right?
No, sir.
But you went to the scene. Did you survey the scene when you arrived?
No, there's a Faro scan that basically is a survey. So if I needed to pull some measurements, I could actually use the Faro for that. You can pull an electronic tape in it. So no, I didn't survey it.
And but you would have relied on the Faro scan for those measurements that you needed if you needed some measurements for that purpose.
I would at the very least start there. I may verify that when I'm at the scene and pull an actual tape or do a laser distance or something like that, depending on what I was measuring.
Okay. And during your animation, you have figures running down Craig Road and turning right down what's been termed the Yellow Brick Road, correct?
Yes.
And how did you sequence those people along the road without a measurement of distance and time?
Well, by taking the start of the event at the in-car video, I think it's 3609, as your start point, locating Taser 1 at, I think it's 3629, I may be off, but that is a fixed point in time. There's a fixed distance there. It's about 300 feet, okay? So using average speeds to transverse that distance, I assign that to both Mr. Scott and Mr. Slager, and then determine the gap between the two by, if you look at Mr. Scott leaving the in-car video, I think it's about at 12 or so, but if you look, he's going to transition to the animation, and then I used Mr. Slager's, when you start to hear the jiggling of the belt, that's pretty much the start of when he's starting to run. And they're not meant to be, hey, that's where those two gentlemen were in that animation or in the incident. They're just visual representations that they transverse this distance and this time. Did they speed up, slow down? Was that their gait? Did they move their arms? That's not the purpose of that.
And you had testified earlier that you once saw a video where people were moving at 51 miles an hour. Is that correct?
Well, luckily they didn't animate that. It had to be pulled out of their still drawing. But yeah, 51 miles an hour, yeah.
And did you do any calculations at what speed these people were traveling at down the road?
I did, and if I recall, it's in the low teens.
And but that's just based on strictly time and distance with no regard to their actual position at any time along the route, other than, as you say, you think you know where one of the tasers was deployed, based on the evidence marked by SLED?
Yes.
And do you have any experience, you don't have any experience in taser deployment as far as the normal pattern for the spread of aphids?
Well, not formal training, no.
Okay.
Personal, yes.
And what about the doors themselves, the taser doors that are ejected? You can't say with certainty what range those would have landed in, correct?
Well, I've done, again, testing of my own. I haven't been to Taser International, their testing. I've reviewed slow motion videos and stuff like that. So I have an idea based on what I've done personally, but I'm not going to testify this is the range.
Okay. And in fact, as was pointed out in your videos, there were a couple of vehicles that went down the road that very well could have disrupted that scene before SLED was able to get there and mark it, correct?
Well, it's possible that some of the objects that we talked about are not in the same position as they were when it actually took place.
Okay, and so when you arrived at the scene, you have talked a little bit about the SLED measurements.
I have.
And did you use the SLED measurements to place your markers, your YSAT markers?
Well, as I think I discussed, we use the SLED measurements to get the rough in point. So we pulled the distances from the poles, we dropped it, we put it there, we took a closer look at the scene photos and saw that they didn't line up. So we took it the next step as I discussed in length.
And by didn't line up, off a little bit, off a lot, did it vary?
It seemed to be at least somewhat consistent in that it seemed that the majority of the markers would move away from the poles. So they moved towards the alleyway, and I'm not sure if they shifted, maybe shifted towards Craig Street, but there was a pattern there. We didn't try and analyze it. There was a general pattern.
And you know if, when SLED was at the crime scene, if they put markers on the poles that they could use to take their measurements from?
I'm not aware of that. What we were told is that it was approximate. They couldn't tell us the exact reference on the poles, whether it's the center of the pole or the outer diameter of the pole. So there's some estimation or approximation in there. Okay,
and when you took your measurements, you used a tripod, a plumb bob, and a specific height?
Yeah, you saw it in the photographs. It's not quite probably 3 foot or so.
But you don't know if that's exactly what SLED did. You were off on your own creating that database, more or less.
Well, we weren't, again, that piece of information wasn't documented. So I didn't know where they were holding their measuring device as far as vertical height off the ground.
Did you ever ask them where they took their measurements?
We did.
And who did you ask?
I didn't talk to the person directly. It was like, hey, we would like to know this information, and it was asked to, I think, Agent Brown, I think his name is, the person who did the measurements, and he wasn't able to provide that information.
When you were taking your plumb bob measurements, where do you center your plumb bob? I was unclear. Is it on the piece of evidence in the case of a specific piece of evidence, such as a cartridge, or is it on the marker itself?
That was another question we asked is the measurement the actual piece of evidence, or is it the marker? And that couldn't be answered either. So we used the marker as our reference to set the initial position. And then we used the photographs to fine-tune the position of the marker.
And were the markers you were using the same dimensions as the marker SLED used, or do you know?
They appeared to be after we placed it. I did not get my hands on their markers and do a measurement, but based on when you look at the fine-tuning with the rocks and then how far off the little tent extends, it certainly looks like they're substantially similar at the very least.
Okay, so you took those measurements and you used them to assist you in creating the animation, correct?
Yes and no. If you look in the animation, you're not going to see marker 1 or 2 in there. So they weren't, all of them weren't included in that animation. They were done each time as part of the exercise to recreate the scene to be able to do the work we did.
And you've mentioned the Faro scanner, which is, would you describe it again to the jury what that is?
Well, it's a device, a laser scanner that you would position. You'd put reference objects out in the field, usually spheres, and it would basically do a 3D scan of that area. You'd move it to another position, you'd do a 3D scan, you move it to another one, and then you'd mesh all those scans together to create a virtual 3D environment of that area.
Now, in a perfect world, a Faro scan would be done pretty close to the time of the incident when the evidence had not been displaced or tampered with, correct?
Depending on the circumstances of the whole event, sure.
And you decided to create your own database, and as part of creating that database, you decided to use, I think you said it was either camera matching or reverse projection. Are they the same thing?
They are.
Okay, so camera matching is the same thing as reverse projection.
Just a different name for it.
And that's part of a subset of something called photogrammetry, is that correct?
It is.
And would you consider photogrammetry an art or a science?
It's both.
Okay. And have you ever had any formal training in photogrammetry?
I have not.
So do you know if there are any certification agencies for photogrammetry?
I believe there are.
But you're not a member of one of those?
I'm not.
Have you ever taught any classes of photogrammetry?
No, I've not.
And have ever written any papers on photogrammetry?
I've not.
Okay, so you're a self-taught photogrammetrist?
Well, keep in mind there's other ways to apply photogrammetry. The reverse projection is just one little subset of the entire field, and I applied that subset.
Okay, and that subset you say is the same as camera match?
In general, yes. You're matching the position, the camera's position at the time the photo or video was taken.
And when you selected frames to camera match, how did you come up with a frame?
I looked at the Santana on-changed or on-enhanced video in a video editor and located shots 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and the frames associated with those.
And how did you locate those frames associated with each shot?
By lining up the shot with the wave pattern.
Okay, and what, did you use a Santana unenhanced video to make that alignment?
I did.
And did you align all the shots or just the first shot?
I'm not sure the question.
Okay, there were 7 shots, correct? That you worked on.
Yeah, there are 8 shots, 7
Yes.
I worked on.
And so you selected a frame
Yes.
to do the matching on. And you used that same frame for each of the shots, is that correct?
No.
So what, did you do a separate match for every shot?
Oh, are you talking about the field work product where I'm matching the camera at the field?
Correct.
Okay, for the compilation, that was, basically, well, we walked through it. I matched shot 1, and then we added a silhouette for each other shot, and we matched it to that compilation of shots 1 through 7.
And do you know if the frame you used, what did you say the frame rate is? And it's around 30 frames per second?
30 frames.
And do you know the difference between a reference frame and a predictive frame in videos?
I do not.
So are you aware that videos, sometimes only video will take forward items that have shown movement so that the frames change from frame to frame? It may be the same information in each frame depending on whether there's any movement.
Okay.
But did you analyze this frame to understand whether it was a predictive frame or a reference frame?
I did not. I looked
Okay.
at it visually.
And when you plotted out then the other positions, did you do the same analysis with them when you were trying to project those onto the frame that you have?
Yeah, I took the frame at the wave where it initiated the shot and chose that frame.
But you then put that frame back on the original.
Yeah, I created that exhibit, I don't know the number in front of me, as I discussed. I used Mr. Slager as the anchor point for each frame added. I kept him in a stationary position because if you watch the video, his feet don't move. So he was my anchor point to create that.
And did you have to add any video, interlace any video or do anything to that reference frame to add all of those figures in there?
Well, basically, as you added the consecutive figure, they would extend. That's why this is longer than the aspect ratio of the original video, because they would extend the length of the image.
So were you stitching together the frames, or how do you lengthen a frame of a video using separate frames?
They're put in layers into an imaging editing program. So you have layer 1 is shot 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4. And when they combine, you see the end result at the bottom.
And what is that video program?
Not video, it's basically Photoshop.
It's a Photoshop program? Is that what you
It's
used?
Photoshop.
Okay, and do you know how Photoshop aligns those images?
I align them,
You align them.
yes.
And you align them based on pixels, or do you align them based on eyeballing, or how do you align them?
Well, eyeball pixels, yes.
So you do both eyeball and pixels. How many frames did it take to recreate this exhibit with the 7 shots? How many different pieces of frames did you have to use?
Those are 7 frames.
So you took one frame and then stitched another one, and then another one, and then another one, and another one, right?
I did.
And you don't know whether any of those frames were predictive frames or reference frames, correct?
I do not.
Okay. Now, when you've got the, let's go back to the beginning of the matching process. You went to the site, and you went to the site and sketched some what you determined to be fixed objects, correct? Traced them?
Sure.
And how did you decide where to start?
As far as where to start my camera,
Yeah, where to place the camera?
if you watch the video at that portion, you can see the fence, top fence pole and the fence come into view and out of view. And you basically, if you were to try this anywhere, you say, okay, it looks like it's about here, and then you move around until it gets closer and closer, and then you attach the camera to something more rigid so you can control its movement. I use that process.
So, and when you were doing this process, were you viewing through the camera, or were you eyeballing, or how did you get to the point where you started refining it?
I was outputting to the monitor we saw earlier.
What kind of monitor were you outputting to?
I could probably zoom in on one of the images. It's just a computer monitor.
Was it an LCD monitor, CRT? What you know what the output was?
I'd have to look.
Do you know if the aspect ratio was the same? Were you getting the same view on your monitor as you were getting on the Santana camera?
I was.
And I think you had, you said you had then you put a transparency?
Yes, the one we saw that I generated for each of the, well, yes.
Okay, and do you know if the transparency changed the image at all? You know, sometimes when you put something in front of a screen, it changes the view that you have.
Through the multiple times I did it, it did not appear when I was looking, put it on, that there's any kind of magnification or distortion or anything like that.
And you kept
Plus,
that?
I'm sorry.
Go right ahead. Sorry.
I was also able to view the smaller, albeit smaller, viewfinder on the phone as I was doing this as well. So.
And did you use the phone viewfinder plus the computer monitor, did you cross-check both of those as you were setting your objects?
Primarily the monitor, but the phone was there to be able to look at too.
And then you said you got cutouts or silhouettes.
We made them, yes.
And how did you go about estimating the size of the silhouettes you were going to use?
Well, by looking through the file, I believe Mr. Scott was 5'9". I looked up his height, and then for each of the frames, and he is changing his gait position, I basically took the best distance from his foot to his head that would represent if he was standing upright, and scaled the larger image to that and printed them out on a large format printer.
By best distance from the foot to the head, what you mean? You just took an estimate. What were the dimensions of the silhouettes you used?
They were targeted at the highest point to be the 5'9", representing a foot to top of head in a vertical orientation.
And what about for Officer Slager?
Same thing. Of course, he was just in one position, but yes, I did. I looked up his height and scaled it to that.
And after you scaled those, step us through how you position them again. So you have some scaled silhouettes.
Yes.
You think you have estimated the point where Santana was filming based on trace outlines of stationary objects.
Yes.
Okay, and then you place a silhouette out there and adjust the silhouette until it matches what you think the frame looks like?
Yes, in essence, yes.
How did you account for lateral offset? Was that done by just eyeballing it for lateral offset?
Yes.
And how about depth?
Depth in this situation has lesser effect than lateral. Okay, we saw that when we were there. We moved the figures in forward and backward, closer to the camera, further from the camera. And we had an idea that where Mr. Slager was, and we had an idea where Mr. Scott ended up, and a fairly straight path based on our analysis to review the video. So we kept them in fairly straight line. We didn't forward and back or make him zigzag or anything like that.
Well, this essentially could be a geometry problem. Is that correct?
In what respect?
Could you mathematically compute those positions as well as eyeballing them?
Well, there's more than one way to accomplish most tasks, sure.
So, but you chose for the eyeball position. Do you have any trigonometry or geometry training to allow you to do camera matching mathematically?
Just what I had in high school.
So once you got the first one, I'm still trying to understand this, that as you look at the exhibit that you created, on the right-hand side where Officer Slager is, that became your anchor point?
Well, to create the background, what you see, yes.
And then you would stitch together pieces of other frames from the video until you had all 7 positions on there. Feel free to step down and take a look at it, or...
No, I don't need to look at it. I was just looking for a couple pieces of paper to maybe use as a demonstrative here.
Well, what do you need? I'll be glad to... You need like just notebook paper?
Sure.
Okay.
Sorry to make you go through that trouble. If this were the base, shot 1, I would bring in shot 2 as a layer and make it semi-transparent in a image editing program. And I would tweak it basically pixel by pixel visually to get an alignment. And if you can imagine that Mr. Slager's over here to the right. When I got an alignment, then I would clear out the area between Mr. Slager and shot 2 so that Shot 1 wasn't totally covered by that because as you add more layers, it become less visible. So if you can imagine a square cut in here with Officer Slager here and the added shot here progressively.
And when you match those up, I think you said you didn't, it wasn't relevant to you whether they were predictive frames or reference frames. You just lined them up. Did you have a pixel count? Is there an objective way of lining them up, or is it a combination of object and subject?
Well, all of the subject frames from shot 1 through 7 have some amount of blur to them. So there's a blur line that you have to take into account, and my estimation looking at the shots or the frames was it's like plus or minus 2 pixels. So that was one factor, is that the base images, because of the blur we've seen in the video, you had to, that was a area that could alternate or affect the alignment. And
when you say, could you explain what you mean when you're off 1 or 2 pixels, or just explain how you align pixels or how you count pixels in doing this matching?
Well, the video is 1920, 1080. Those are pixels. And what I did is I looked at one of the 2x4 ends. It's a 3.5-inch distance for a 2x4, and captured the pixels for that, divided it by 3.5, and came up with somewhere around 4 pixels per inch is what I came up with for the base images.
And you use that to help you align those images together?
No, I use that as understanding what my error rate may be later on.
And so you did that with the first image, or pardon me, silhouette of Mr. Scott, and aligned the first one. How did you do the successive ones? I mean, you've explained how you measured them. How did you initially place them?
Well, if you can imagine, I'm at the camera, and I've got Mikey downstream where the silhouettes are, and we're, let's say, on number 2, and say we're 130 feet away or so. I'm looking at what it looks like, and then I put I've got the transparency there, and I can flip back and forth. I capture a frame, I put it over top the transparency, I look at where it's at, and I say we got to go left, we got to go right. And then when he gets it, I say we've got it, and I capture that frame.
And I believe you said in your direct testimony that it would have taken you an awful long time to do all 7 of those, so that's why you just based them all off the first frame?
Yeah, what I explained to the solicitor was, of course, shot 1's the most critical. We spent the most time on shot 1. That I can give you a approximation. It's going to be with more error rate for shots 2 through 7, so you'll have a visual of all of them together. But you are growing the error rate with adding or doing the process we're discussing.
So in fact, the error rate are cumulative, right? So if there's an error where the camera is placed, and then an error in the silhouette, and an error where something else is placed, I mean, these errors can become cumulative. Is that correct?
With any process.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And at the end, you produced this, which the purpose, I think you said, was to give the jury a view of what it looked like at each shot, what the perspective is at each shot, so that if you were Santana and you had a stop frame motion, that's what it would have looked like?
Yes, approximately what we're looking at here.
Your Honor, I have a matter of law very quickly, if you don't mind.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we have you go to the jury room.
Judge, we have an issue with with how this was presented in the PowerPoint presentation. We think that there was a presentation of this exhibit that is somewhat misleading, and we'd like the court to take a look at it, and perhaps Mr. Williams has an explanation. I just don't know. It came to our attention as we were looking through the PowerPoint presentation, and I'd like to explain how the slides were put into the PowerPoint that we showed and where there may be some discrepancies. So I don't know the best way to do this, Mr. Williams. If you want to turn the screen around, or if you want to work from the solicitor's table with your material, however it works for you is fine with me.
Okay.
Tell me again the nature of the objection.
Yes, sir. The nature of the objection is that there have been some misleading images, we think, that were shown to the jury in the PowerPoint presentation, and we want to make sure that those, the jury is asked, if they were misleading, to disregard those and or to check this. This was actually introduced last, and we think the jury may have a lasting impression of a depiction that is incorrect from the PowerPoint presentation, and I think we can show it. And
what is incorrect, the PowerPoint presentation or the exhibit that's in
That's
evidence?
what we're trying to determine, Your Honor. So, yeah.
All right, response by the state.
I don't know what he's talking about, so
All right.
he hasn't explained what he's talking about.
All right, well, let's all stand and get a good stretch before we move forward. Yes. Let's take 2 minutes. How about that?